The morning sun hit the concrete of Halfway Tree like a physical blow. It was not a gentle awakening. It was an assault of light and heat that turned the pavement into a searing grid. The air hung thick, already heavy with the smell of exhaust and baking dust. High above, the sky was a flat, unforgiving blue, offering no shade to the sprawling city below. Every surface absorbed the glare, reflecting it back in shimmering waves that distorted the horizon. The silence of the pre-dawn hours evaporated, replaced by the low, grinding hum of a city stirring from its sleep. Tires hissed against the warming asphalt. Distant sirens cut through the thickening haze, sharp and rhythmic. The heat radiated upward, stinging the skin and blurring the edges of the buildings. It was a relentless, grinding start to the day, a reminder that the environment itself was an adversary. The city roared to life, signaling that the struggle for survival had officially begun. Samuel remained a still shape against the gray expanse of the pavement. His eyes opened to the glare, but he did not move. Every muscle was locked, stiffened by the night spent on the unyielding surface. He shifted his weight, and a sharp, dry pop echoed from his shoulder, followed by the dull ache of his knees. He braced his palms against the grit, feeling the rough texture bite into his skin. He pushed. His arms trembled, muscle straining against the weight of his own exhaustion. He paused, breath hitching. He pushed again, harder, driving his heels into the ground until he was crouched. He straightened his back, vertebrae clicking into place, and finally locked his knees. He stood there, swaying slightly. The city around him was already beginning to pulse with the rhythm of traffic. He forced his gaze forward away from the ground. Samuel stood motionless as the city rushed past him in a blur of motion. He needed to know where he stood before the day demanded everything from him. He reached into his right pocket. Empty. Just a collection of lint and a stray piece of grit. He shifted his weight, his fingers brushing the fabric of his other pocket. He dug deeper, his nails scraping the lining. There, tucked into the corner, he felt the familiar, coarse texture of paper. He pulled it out slowly. It was a $50 bill, folded into a tight, uneven square. He smoothed the edges with his thumb, feeling the creases. It was not much, but it was everything. It was the only thing that separated him from total abandonment. He held it tightly, the paper warm against his palm, a small, fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. He looked at the bill, then back at the chaotic intersection. He tucked it back into his pocket, patting the spot twice to ensure it was secure. He took a deep, steadying breath and prepared to face the morning. The sun broke over the skyline, hitting the concrete of Halfway Tree like a physical blow. Samuel squinted against the sudden sharp glare that turned the pavement into a blinding white sheet. He shifted his weight, and his shadow detached itself from his feet, stretching long and thin across the grit. It was a dark, jagged line that pointed toward the center of the intersection. He took the first step, his boots scraping against the uneven surface. The sound was small, swallowed instantly by the rising roar of the city. He walked with a heavy, deliberate gait, his shadow trailing behind him like a tether he could not cut. Every movement was a calculation, a measured response to the environment. He watched the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, then shifted his focus to the shifting patterns of the crowd. He was a ghost in the machine, a silhouette carving a path through the noise. He walked, and the city walked with him, indifferent and vast. Samuel watched the tide of people surging toward the transit hub. He did not rush. He waited for the pulse of the crowd to stabilize, then stepped into the slipstream. He matched his stride to the person ahead, shortening his gait to keep the distance constant. Left, right, left, right. He focused on the rhythm of boots hitting the pavement, a steady, percussive beat that drowned out his own thoughts. When the mass shifted, he shifted with it, banking around corners without breaking his cadence. He kept his head down, eyes scanning the ground, avoiding the direct contact that would mark him as an individual. A man bumped his shoulder. Samuel absorbed the impact, adjusted his angle, and kept moving. He felt the collective heat of the bodies pressing in from all sides. He was no longer Samuel. He was a component in a larger, grinding machine. He slowed his pace to let a group pass, then accelerated to fill the gap they left behind. He was learning the art of being present without being seen. Every muscle in his legs burned from the constant, unnatural tension of the mimicry. He held the rhythm, his breath shallow and steady. He was invisible. Samuel pulled himself out of the pedestrian current and leaned against a cold brick wall. He stopped moving with the crowd to start watching it. Across the street, a shopkeeper wrestled with a heavy metal shutter, his movements sharp and impatient. Samuel noted the way the man checked his watch before unlocking the door. It was a ritual of time. He turned his attention to the taxi stand. Drivers sat behind their wheels, scanning the sidewalk with predatory focus. He watched one driver ignore a waving hand, only to pull over for a woman who hadn't even signaled. It was not about the signs or the lights. It was about the intent behind the action. Samuel cataloged these behaviors, building a mental map of the intersection. He saw the way the street vendors shifted their stalls when the police patrol passed, a silent, coordinated dance of avoidance. He watched the delivery trucks double park, their engines idling with a low, vibrating hum that rattled his teeth. Every person had a tell, a specific rhythm that betrayed their next move. He was no longer just walking the streets. He was decoding them. He observed the taxi drivers fighting for position, their hands gripping the steering wheels, their eyes darting between the traffic. He saw the hierarchy of the block, defined by who held ground and who yielded. He was learning how the city breathed, and more importantly, how it broke. The sun climbed higher, baking the pavement until the heat shimmered in the air. Samuel shifted his weight, and a sharp, hollow ache bloomed in his gut. It started as a dull pull, then sharpened into a persistent, gnawing cramp. He pressed his palm against his abdomen, trying to flatten the sensation. But the hunger was a living thing. It tightened, twisting into a hard, knotted fist that made his breath hitch. He looked at the shop windows, seeing the displays of bread and fruit through a haze of rising asphalt fumes. The smell of frying oil drifted from a nearby stall, and his stomach lurched in response, a violent, involuntary spasm. He forced himself to look away, focusing on the grit under his boots to ground his thoughts. The pain was no longer a background hum. It was the primary beat of his existence. He felt the $50 in his pocket, the paper thin and fragile against his thigh. It was his only leverage against the void, yet the hunger demanded he trade it. Samuel moved to the edge of the intersection, where the concrete met the asphalt in a jagged, heat-cracked line. He planted his feet, feeling the vibration of the city through his soles. The traffic lights hung above like giant, unblinking eyes, red, yellow, green. He watched the cycle. It was a pulse, a mechanical heartbeat that dictated the flow of the entire block. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the amber light. He felt the rush of air as a bus roared past, the exhaust stinging his throat, but he did not flinch. He was studying the intervals. When the light turned red, the car slowed, their brakes screaming in a discordant chorus. When it turned green, the tension broke, and the metal tide surged forward. He watched the drivers, their faces blurred behind glass, their hands tight on the wheels. He was not just waiting, he was calculating. He treated the intersection as a hunting ground, observing the gaps in the traffic where the flow faltered. He timed his own movements to the shifting lights, waiting for the precise moment when the chaos would provide an opening. His attention shifted from the machines to the human elements within the grid. A boy, no older than 12, emerged from the shadows of a delivery truck. He moved with a liquid, practiced grace, weaving through the idling cars like a needle through fabric. Samuel watched, his own breathing slowing to match the boy's rhythm. The child reached out, palm open, tapping on windows with a light, rhythmic persistence. His face was a mask, perfectly still, devoid of any plea or desperation. It was a calculated, hollow expression, designed to be ignored. Samuel tracked the boy's progress as he moved from a sedan to a taxi, his movements efficient and utterly devoid of hesitation. There was no fear in the boy's eyes, only a cold, professional focus. He was a ghost in the machinery of the city, a fixture of the intersection that most drivers looked right through. Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the heat. He saw the boy's future reflected in the way he navigated the exhaust and the indifference of the commuters. It was a mirror, sharp and unforgiving, showing him exactly what the streets demanded of those who stayed too long. The boy turned, his eyes locking onto Samuel's for a fleeting second, and in that gaze, Samuel saw the hard, calcified reality of his own path forward. The boy vanished into the crowd, leaving Samuel alone on the concrete island. The intersection felt suddenly vast, a canyon of steel and glass that demanded a price he was not yet ready to pay. He looked at his own hands, steady and clean, and felt the sudden, violent surge of his own pride. It was not an abstract concept. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating shroud that tightened around his chest. He tried to force his arm to lift, to mimic the boy's fluid motion, but his muscles locked. The thought of extending his palm, of inviting the rejection he had just witnessed, felt like a slow, deliberate death. His throat constricted, dry and tight, as if he were swallowing glass. He stood rooted to the spot. He was trapped in the space between who he was and what he had to become, and the silence was louder than the roar. The roar of the city surged, a wall of sound that pushed against his resolve. Samuel stared at the line of idling cars, their metal surfaces reflecting the harsh midday glare. He needed to move. He needed to bridge the gap between the curb and the first window. He shifted his weight, but his legs felt like leaden weights, anchored to the concrete by a stubborn internal gravity. He forced his right foot forward, a jagged, unnatural movement that sent a jolt of resistance through his hips. He stopped. The air felt thin, sharp, and impossible to draw into his lungs. He looked down at his boots, the leather scuffed and thick with road dust. He tried again, dragging his heel across the grit, the sound of rubber scraping against asphalt cutting through the ambient hum. It was a slow, agonizing crawl of inches. Every muscle in his legs tightened, fighting the command to advance. He was a man trying to walk through deep water, his own pride acting as the current pushing him back. He took another half step, his toes digging into the uneven surface, his breath hitching in his throat. He was not just moving toward a car, he was moving toward the destruction of his own image. The metal of the sedan was hot against his fingertips. Samuel stood at the threshold of the driver's side window, his shadow falling across the glass. He focused on the interior, the smell of stale air conditioning and leather drifting out through the gap in the seal. The driver sat motionless, his hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, knuckles white against the dark leather. Samuel waited for the shift in focus, the subtle turn of a head, or the flicker of a glance that would acknowledge his presence. It did not come. The man stared straight ahead, eyes locked onto the red light as if Samuel were nothing more than a smudge on the glass or a trick of the midday heat. The silence inside the car was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed the noise of the street. Samuel stood there, his own breath shallow, feeling the strange, chilling sensation of being looked through. He was a ghost in the middle of the intersection, a physical object that occupied space, yet failed to register on the driver's consciousness. The light remained red. The engine hummed a low, steady vibration, and the driver remained a statue of indifference. Samuel raised his hand. The skin of his knuckles hovered inches from the glass, trembling slightly in the heat. He needed this moment to end. He tapped once, a sharp, metallic sound that barely cut through the idling engine's drone. Nothing. The driver remained a statue, eyes fixed on the changing traffic light. Samuel tapped again, harder this time, his fingernails clicking against the window with a desperate, rhythmic urgency. The driver finally moved. His head snapped toward the window, his jaw tightening into a hard, jagged line. He did not look at Samuel with pity or even anger. He looked at him with a cold, practiced sneer that curled his lip. The man's hand rose, not to reach for his wallet, but to deliver a sharp, dismissive wave that sliced through the air between them. The car lurched forward, leaving him alone in the exhaust, the sting of the encounter settling into his bones like a heavy, suffocating weight. Samuel stepped back, his boots dragging through the grit of the intersection, his heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic, uneven rhythm that echoed the pulsing of the city around him. He pressed a hand to his chest, trying to force the frantic beat to slow, but the heat of the asphalt seemed to rise up and choke him. He stood on the curb, watching the sedan disappear into the stream of traffic, the exhaust fumes still clinging to his skin. The $50 in his pocket felt heavy, a mocking weight that reminded him of his own fragility. He was not just hungry, he was exposed. Every person passing by seemed to be a judge, their indifference a verdict he could not escape. He looked down at his palms, seeing the grime of the street etched into his skin. He could turn back now, walk away from the intersection, and keep the money for another day. But the hunger in his stomach was a constant, gnawing pressure. He took a deep, ragged breath, forcing his shoulders to square. He took one step, then another, moving toward the next window. Samuel reached the next vehicle, a sleek, dark sedan idling at the edge of the lane. He stopped, his shadow falling across the passenger window. Inside, a woman sat bathed in the soft, artificial glow of her smartphone. Her thumb moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic speed, scrolling through a feed. Samuel leaned in, his face inches from the glass. He waited for her to look up, for the flicker of recognition that would acknowledge he was a living human being. She did not blink. Her eyes remained locked on the screen, her expression a mask of serene, digital detachment. He tapped the glass, a soft, tentative sound that barely registered against the hum of the city. She didn't flinch. She didn't shift her weight. She was physically present, but mentally miles away, shielded by a wall of glass and pixels. Samuel watched her thumb continue its endless, mechanical dance. He felt a sudden, sharp clarity. To her, he was not a person, but a glitch in the background, a blur of movement that didn't warrant a glance. The light turned, and she pulled away, leaving him standing in the exhaust of her passing. Samuel moved to the third car in the line, his boots heavy on the grit. He did not hesitate this time. He reached the driver's side window and tapped the glass with the flat of his palm. The sound was sharp, a sudden intrusion into the cabin. The driver, a man with a tight, rigid jaw, turned his head slowly. His eyes did not scan Samuel. They pinned him. The man reached for the control panel. The window slid down just enough to create a narrow, jagged gap. A rush of air-conditioned air hit Samuel, smelling of stale coffee and expensive leather. The man did not wait for a plea or a gesture. He leaned toward the opening, his mouth twisting into a hard, thin line. "Get a job, kid," he barked, the words hitting Samuel with the force of a physical shove. Before Samuel could draw breath to respond, the man punched the button. The glass rose with a smooth, mechanical hiss, sealing the gap with a final, decisive click. Samuel stood rooted to the spot, his hand still extended toward the cold surface of the glass. The rejection was absolute and cold. Samuel backed away from the lane, his boots dragging through the thick, oily dust of the intersection. He reached the curb and collapsed onto the concrete, his legs losing their strength all at once. The air here was different. It was thick, shimmering with the heat radiating off the blacktop, and it tasted of burnt rubber and exhaust. He pulled his lungs wide, but the air felt thin, refusing to satisfy the demand of his chest. His breath came in, ragged, uneven gasps that tore at his throat. He pressed his palms into the grit, feeling the rough texture of the pavement bite into his skin. The sun beat down on his shoulders, a heavy, relentless weight. He looked at his hands, shaking, and then at the $50 in his pocket. The paper felt like lead. He leaned his head back against the vertical face of the curb, his eyes stinging from the rising heat and the salt of his own sweat. He was not just hungry. He was depleted. The city roared around him, a cacophony of engines and shouting, but he was trapped in a pocket of silence, fighting for the simple, mechanical act of breathing. The roar of the intersection continued, a relentless wave of sound that pressed against Samuel's ears. He remained slumped on the curb, his eyes fixed on the oil-stained asphalt between his boots. Then, the rhythm of the traffic shifted. A silver sedan pulled into the lane directly in front of him, its engine idling with a soft, steady hum that cut through the surrounding static. The passenger window lowered. Samuel did not look up immediately. He expected the same sharp dismissal or the cold, clinical silence he had endured all day. He kept his gaze low, his hands gripping the edge of the concrete. But the car did not move. Samuel shifted his weight, his muscles protesting, and finally lifted his head. He looked into the cabin. The woman behind the wheel was looking back. Her eyes were tired, but they were fixed firmly on his face. The woman did not break the connection. She shifted her focus from his eyes to the space between them, her arm moving with a slow, deliberate precision. Her hand left the steering wheel and reached into the center console. Samuel watched the movement, his own hand resting limp on his knee. She pulled a single coin from the compartment. It caught the harsh, midday light, a flash of metallic silver that seemed to vibrate in the air. She leaned toward the open window, her fingers extending through the gap. Samuel reached out, his movements stiff and unpracticed. As his palm met hers, the world around them underwent a sudden, violent shift. The grinding of gears, the frantic honking of the taxis, and the distant shouting vanished. The sound was replaced by a low, humming silence that centered entirely on the point where her skin brushed his. The coin was cold, a sharp contrast to the humid heat. Her fingers lingered against his palm, pressing the metal firmly into his skin. He felt the texture of the coin, the ridges of its edge, and the steady pressure of her grip. The intersection, the concrete, and the suffocating weight of the day fell away. There was only the weight of the metal, and the physical reality of another person acknowledging his existence. The silence held for a heartbeat longer. Then, the woman leaned closer, her lips parting just enough to shape the words. "Eat something," she whispered. The sound was clear, devoid of judgment, a simple directive that cut through the lingering stillness. Her fingers slid away from his palm, the sudden loss of contact leaving his skin feeling exposed to the humid air. Samuel blinked, his focus sharpening as the ambient roar of the intersection rushed back in like a tide. The woman withdrew her hand, pulled the gear shift, and the engine note deepened. He watched her knuckles tighten on the wheel. The sedan lurched forward, the tires biting into the grit of the road as she merged into the flow of traffic. He stood motionless, his arms still extended, watching the silver shape shrink against the backdrop of the city. The exhaust fumes drifted past him, thick and acrid. He turned his attention to his palm. The coin sat there, a solid, heavy weight against his skin. It was still warm from her touch. He curled his fingers over it. The traffic light cycled back to red, but the silver sedan was already a distant speck in the flow of the city. Samuel did not move. He stood on the edge of the curb, his feet planted firmly on the cracked asphalt. The heat radiating from the ground pushed upward, yet the coin in his palm remained a distinct, separate temperature. He tightened his grip, feeling the sharp edge of the metal press into his skin. The texture was etched into his palm, a map of ridges and grooves that felt more real than the grit beneath his boots. He opened his hand just a fraction, letting the sun catch the silver surface. It glowed, a small, concentrated point of light in the gray haze of the intersection. Around him, the city resumed its frantic pace. A taxi braked hard, the tires screeching against the pavement, but the sound seemed to pass through him rather than touch him. He felt the weight of the coin, a heavy, grounding anchor that pulled his focus away from the noise. It was not just metal. He closed his fingers again, shielding the warmth from the wind. His heart rate settled into a slow, steady rhythm. The coin was a lifeline. Samuel turned away from the intersection, his eyes scanning the storefronts for the familiar steam of a food stall. He walked 2 blocks, his pace steady, his hand never leaving the coin in his pocket. He found a vendor tucked into a narrow alleyway, the air thick with the scent of charred meat and spices. He approached the counter, placed the coin down, and waited. The vendor slid a small paper bowl across the metal surface. Samuel took the bowl and retreated to the shadow of a brick wall, away from the main thoroughfare. He sat on the ground. He used a plastic spoon to scoop up the rice and chicken. He ate slowly, counting the grains, savoring the texture. He chewed until the food was gone, feeling the warmth spread from his stomach to his limbs. He scraped the bottom of the bowl. The hunger that had been a knotted fist in his gut began to loosen. He set the empty bowl aside and leaned his head against the wall. The sky above the alleyway deepened from a bruised purple to a solid ink-black void. The warmth of the day evaporated, replaced by a sharp, biting chill that clung to the brickwork. Samuel pushed himself up from the ground, his joints stiffening in the cooling air. The city noise underwent a metamorphosis. The frantic, rhythmic pulse of the daytime traffic slowed into a series of jagged, unpredictable sounds. Distant sirens wailed, cutting through the heavy silence of the side streets. He stepped out from the shadow of the wall, his boots crunching on broken glass and discarded debris. The street had changed. Where there were once crowds, there were now shifting, elongated shapes that moved with caution. He felt the air grow dense with the scent of damp concrete and ozone. He pulled his shoulders back, testing the weight of his own frame. The day had stripped away the hesitation, leaving behind a cold, hard focus. He took a breath, tasted the metallic tang of the night, and began to move. Samuel navigated the block until he reached a storefront with metal shutters pulled tight. The recessed doorway offered a sliver of protection from the wind. He knelt, his knees hitting the grit, and swept a pile of discarded flyers and broken plastic aside with his palms. He needed a clear view of the sidewalk. Once the ground was bare, he lowered himself into a tight ball, his back pressed firmly against the cold metal of the shutter. He did not close his eyes. Instead, he began a systematic sweep of the darkness. He watched the way the street lamp flickered, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the opposite wall. He tracked the sound of footsteps, identifying the rhythm of a lone passerby 2 streets over, then the distant rhythmic hum of a late-night delivery truck. Every movement in his peripheral vision triggered a sharp, involuntary tightening of his muscles. He counted the seconds between the passing of stray cats and the shifting of trash bags. His breathing was shallow, controlled, and silent. He kept his chin tucked, his eyes darting from the mouth of the alley to the edge of the curb. He was a statue of alertness, his senses stretched to their limit. The darkness was no longer a void. It was a map of potential threats and clear paths. A scent drifted from a nearby dumpster, a sharp, rotting odor that pierced the night air. For a split second, the smell triggered a phantom image. A kitchen table, the steam of a hot meal, the sound of a door closing behind him. Samuel jerked his head, his neck muscles straining against the sudden intrusion. He pressed his palms harder into the pavement, feeling the jagged texture of the grit bite into his skin. The memory of that table dissolved, replaced by the biting cold of the metal shutter against his spine. He focused on the physical pain in his joints, the rough surface beneath his palms, and the steady, rhythmic vibration of the city deep underground. He deliberately exhaled, pushing the ghost of his former life out with his breath. There was no room for the warmth of a home that no longer existed. The concrete was his reality now. It was hard, unforgiving, and absolute. He traced the cracks in the sidewalk with his eyes, mapping the uneven surface as if it were a blueprint. Every sensation, the dampness of the air, the grit under his fingertips, the chill radiating from the brick, served as a tether, pulling him deeper into the present. The past was a blur, a fading echo that lost its shape against the brutal, immediate pressure of the street. Samuel shifted his weight, finding the exact point where the metal shutter met the concrete. He stopped fighting the hardness of the ground and instead let his body align with the angles of the doorway. The city was not just noise anymore. It was language. He listened to the low-frequency thrum of the subway tunnels vibrating through the soles of his boots. He tracked the specific pitch of a siren 3 blocks away, noting how it bounced off the glass towers before fading into the hum of the ventilation fans on the roof above. He categorized the sounds: the sharp, metallic clatter of a dumpster lid, the rhythmic hiss of air brakes from a distant bus, the soft, irregular scuff of footsteps on loose gravel. Each sound was a data point. He cataloged the timing of the traffic lights by the change in the engine idle of the few cars passing through the intersection. He was no longer waiting for the morning to save him. He was studying the architecture of the night. He pressed his ear against the brick, feeling the residual heat of the day slowly bleeding out. The darkness began to thin, turning from deep charcoal to a bruised pale gray. Samuel watched the horizon, his eyes unblinking, tracking the slow retreat of the shadows. The city remained quiet, a held breath before the morning rush. He pushed his palms against the rough brick, feeling the grit shift under his skin, and pulled himself to his feet. His muscles were stiff, aching from the long hours on the pavement, but he did not favor them. He stood straight, testing his balance on the uneven surface. He looked down at the intersection, now empty and still, and visualized the flow of the coming crowd. He would not be the one weaving through traffic with a desperate hand today. He clenched his jaw, the tension radiating through his neck. He was ready. As the first sliver of light hit the top of the concrete buildings, Samuel stepped away from the wall. He did not look back. The city roared to life, a sudden, violent surge of movement that would have crushed him yesterday. Samuel stepped into the stream of commuters, his pace perfectly matched to the rhythm of the crowd. He was no longer a static object in their path. He was part of the flow. He navigated the intersection with surgical precision, shifting his weight to avoid collisions before they happened, his eyes scanning the faces of the people around him. He saw a boy standing near the curb, hand outstretched, eyes darting toward the idling cars. Samuel stopped for a fraction of a second, his gaze locking onto the boy. Then he turned and kept moving. He did not offer a coin. He did not offer a word. He reached the far side of the street and leaned against a steel pole, watching the chaos from a position of total control. He was hungry, he was tired, and he was entirely alone, but the fear that had defined his existence was gone. He pushed off the pole and walked into the heart of the city, his stride steady and his focus absolute. He was the architect of his own survival now.